Gisele Bündchen had always believed that the past should remain in the past. Her Miami home, a sanctuary of peace and sun-soaked mornings, had slowly become a cocoon where she could rebuild herself. But on a quiet Tuesday, while rearranging cookbooks in her kitchen, her fingers brushed against something unexpected, a sealed envelope. Yellowed slightly with age, it was tucked between 2 pages of a vegan recipe collection she rarely used. Her heart stuttered. The handwriting was unmistakable. Tom's, bold, slanted, familiar. It read simply, Gisele. She stared at it for a long time. Was it a joke? Something forgotten in the chaos of moving out? Or worse, something that should have stayed hidden? Before we discover the truth hidden in this letter, make sure to subscribe for more stories that bring real emotions to life. Gisele's fingers trembled as she held the envelope. Her kitchen, usually filled with warmth and the sound of her children's chatter, felt unnaturally silent. Outside, the Miami heat shimmered over the palm trees, casting shadows that danced across the marble floor. Inside, time seemed to slow. Since the divorce, Gisele had poured herself into mindfulness, her children, and quiet moments of reflection. She practiced yoga at dawn. She journaled. She reminded herself daily that peace was a choice. Still, this letter, unassuming as it was, felt like a tidal wave pressing against the dam she had carefully built. Memories surged forth, uninvited. Their first apartment in Boston. That road trip through Big Sur. The night he told her, tears in his eyes, that he couldn't imagine a future without her. And later, the colder memories, missed birthdays, long silences after arguments, and his 1,000-yard stare on game days. What could this letter possibly say? She brought it to the sunlit dining table and sat down slowly, staring at it. Her hands hovered. Open it, or throw it away. Her rational mind urged her to walk away. But the part of her that still wondered why, that ached for something unspoken, won. She slid her finger under the seal and gently opened it. Inside was a single page, handwritten. The ink had bled in one corner as if someone had once cried over it. It was dated 7 months ago, before the divorce had been finalized, but after the papers had been drawn. She inhaled sharply. The letter began with no introduction, just a sentence that struck her like a lightning bolt. I didn't know how to say this to your face, and I was a coward for that. She stared at those words. They weren't the words of a man she knew. Not Tom the quarterback, not Tom the public figure. These were the words of Tom the human being. And they cracked open something in her chest. Her breath caught. She hadn't even read more than a line, but already her throat burned. She folded the letter shut, pressing it to her chest. Could she go on reading? The choice didn't feel simple. It felt like crossing a threshold. This letter, lost or hidden then found, had been waiting. And maybe, in some strange way, so had she. She stood up, glassy-eyed, and walked to the window. Outside, 2 birds danced between palm fronds. The world carried on. But inside, something had just begun. Gisele sat back down, her hands still trembling. The letter lay open now, exposed like a wound that had waited too long to be dressed. She took a deep breath, let the air fill her lungs, and began to read. I didn't know how to say this to your face, and I was a coward for that. I let so many things go unsaid, thinking there would always be more time. But time has a way of running out when you're not paying attention. Her vision blurred. The next lines took her to a place she hadn't thought about in years, Costa Rica. He wrote about a night when they sat barefoot by a fire, drinking wine and talking about their dreams. He described how her laughter echoed through the trees, and how, in that moment, he thought he'd never need anything more. She remembered it too. The scent of the ocean, the warmth of the sand, the way they had felt completely alone in the world and entirely whole. That memory had been buried beneath so many others, busier, messier ones. But now, here it was, as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. She read on. I didn't know how to balance the things I loved. Football took so much from me, and I gave it willingly even when it started costing me pieces of us. You always deserved more than my leftovers, but I convinced myself you understood. I think that was the first lie I told myself. Giselle's heart ached. He had never said this before, not in words, not when it mattered. She remembered all the nights she'd stayed awake, lying next to him while he drifted into restless sleep, already dreaming of the next play, the next game, the next victory. She had learned to be quiet, supportive, strong, but strength had its limits. Tears slid silently down her face as she continued. I saw how unhappy you were, and I told myself you were just tired. I saw how you pulled away, and I told myself it was stress, but deep down I knew. I just couldn't bear to face it because facing it meant facing myself. It was raw, more vulnerable than any sideline moment, any interview, any family photo. This was Tom without the helmet, without the armor. He had written about their children, how proud he was of the way Gisele raised them with grace and patience, especially when he wasn't around. He admitted that he'd taken her for granted, that he'd seen her holding up their family like an invisible pillar, and instead of thanking her, he kept asking her to hold more. Gisele wiped her cheeks, unable to stop the flood of emotion building in her chest. Then she reached a line that shattered her completely. I never told you this, but I used to listen to you breathe at night. I'd turn toward you when you were asleep and remind myself how lucky I was. I just never found the courage to say it aloud while you were awake. She pressed the paper to her heart. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Not because it hurt, but because it was too much, too real. This wasn't closure. This was something else, a message that had waited for her to be ready, and now she was. The silence in the room had shifted. It was no longer heavy. It was sacred. Gisele leaned back in her chair, staring at the letter resting in her lap. Her eyes were red, her face damp. The words continued to echo in her head, as if the voice reading them came not from paper, but from the Tom she once knew intimately, and perhaps never fully. She closed her eyes and allowed the memories to surface. The cracks had started small, a missed dinner, a forgotten date night, a look that lingered too long on a phone instead of her eyes. She told herself they were temporary, symptoms of a life built under pressure, but one by one those moments turned into patterns, and patterns into walls. Tom had always been disciplined, brilliant under pressure, but that same focus, so celebrated on the field, had become a wedge between them. His drive became a distance, and Gisele. She grew tired of reaching across that distance alone. Yet here in this letter he saw it all. He had noticed, and he regretted it. The world saw us as perfect, he wrote, but I knew we weren't, and I was afraid to admit it because it felt like failure. But the real failure was not trying to fix it before it broke completely. She thought of the press photos, the red carpet smiles, the interviews where they spoke of support and balance, words that sounded polished but were paper thin in private. The letter didn't make excuses. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It simply told the truth. There were things I should have said, like how you were the strongest person I knew, how you made me better even when I resented it, and how losing you will always be the price I pay for staying silent too long. She exhaled shakily. How different might things have been if he had said this sooner? But she already knew the answer. Life had moved forward. Choices had been made. Hearts had healed in their own ways. Still, the honesty in these lines struck a chord so deep it made her question her own silence. The things she had left unsaid in fear of sounding desperate, angry, or ungrateful. Then, the letter shifted. Tom began to speak of a time after their separation, when he went on a spiritual retreat in Montana, alone, disconnected, seeking clarity. It was there in a cabin surrounded by pine trees and stillness that he had been asked to write letters to the people he had hurt. I didn't expect your name to come so quickly, he wrote. It was the first name on my list, and I couldn't stop writing once I started. Gisele's lips parted. This was no casual note. It was a soul pouring itself onto paper. Then came something she hadn't expected at all. I want you to know, the real reason I decided to retire when I did wasn't just for my health. It was because I read this letter again, and I realized I didn't want to become a man who kept choosing legacy over love. Gisele's breath caught. He had made the final call not on a field, but in a moment of personal reckoning. She stared at those words, stunned. Maybe no one else would ever know the true reason. Maybe no one else needed to. But she did. And now, everything felt different. The letter trembled in Gisele's hands, not from its weight, but from what it had released inside her, a cascade of emotions too complex to name. The anger she thought had faded, the grief she believed was healed, the love she assumed was dormant, all stirred like sediment in clear water, suddenly visible again. She reread that final confession. Tom's decision to retire wasn't only about his health or his legacy. It was about her, about their story. It changed everything, and yet it didn't demand anything. He hadn't asked for another chance. There were no pleas, no apologies masked as invitations. Just honesty, raw, respectful, maybe even reverent. Gisele folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table as though it might break. She sat in stillness, absorbing its echo. Then, as if guided by instinct, she reached for her phone and dialed someone she hadn't spoken to in days, her closest friend, Mariana. The phone rang twice. "Gee," Mariana answered. "You okay?" Gisele's voice cracked. "I just read something, and I need to read part of it to you." She didn't wait for permission. She began reading the part about Costa Rica, about his fears, about the spiritual retreat. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Mariana whispered, "My God, he really saw you, after all this time." Gisele didn't reply. She couldn't. Her throat was thick with unshed tears. Mariana continued gently, "Are you going to reach out to him?" Gisele stared at the sunlight dancing across her table. "I don't know," she said. "I think I just needed to hear this, to feel it. I don't know if a response is even the point." That night, long after the kids were asleep, Gisele sat by the window with a pen and notebook in hand, not to reply to Tom, but to speak for herself. She wrote, "You'll probably never read this, and maybe that's okay, maybe this is just for me. There were things I never said too, like how proud I was of you when you held our newborn for the first time, how deeply I admired your drive, even when I hated what it took from us, and how sometimes I looked at you and felt more alone than I ever admitted. But I never stopped loving you. Not the way people imagine. Love can shift, it can soften, it can exist without longing, and maybe that's what we have now, a different kind of love, one that no longer needs to hold, but will never let go entirely." She wrote for nearly an hour. Memories poured onto the page. Their first date, the jokes only they understood, the long walks in the off-season when it felt like the world didn't exist. And then, at the very end, "Thank you for the letter, for your truth, and for reminding me of mine." She folded the pages and placed them in a drawer, not to send, but to keep. It felt right, complete. She thought about that night in Costa Rica again. The sand, the fire, the way they had danced barefoot, with nothing but the stars to witness them. It wasn't a loss, it was a chapter. And this letter, both his and hers, was the epilogue they didn't know they needed. Morning sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains as Gisele sat by her bedroom window, the quiet hum of Miami just beginning to stir outside. Her hands moved with care, placing the two letters, Tom's and the one she had written, into a small, hand-carved wooden box. She paused. Then gently she closed the lid. It clicked softly like a heartbeat. And with that, the chapter closed, not in anger or regret, but in reverence. The box joined a few precious items in a private shelf, a photo of her children, a feather from a shaman ceremony, a dried flower from her grandmother's garden. Symbols of things that had shaped her. This letter belonged among them now, a piece of truth, preserved. For the first time in a long time, her chest felt light. She didn't feel like a woman who had lost. She felt like a woman who had lived, deeply, painfully, beautifully. She stepped outside, barefoot, the way she used to in Brazil as a child. The grass was still cool from the night. A breeze brushed against her skin like a whisper. She raised her face to the sun, closed her eyes, and breathed in. Tom's letter hadn't reopened old wounds. It had healed something neither of them had been able to during their marriage: the silence. Not everything needed resolution. Some things only needed to be seen, spoken, honored. She walked slowly across the garden, her body moving with grace. Inside, the world had stopped spinning so fast. Her heart had found its rhythm again. As she turned to head back inside, her phone buzzed with a message from her daughter. "Love you, Mama, you're my sunshine." Gisele smiled, eyes shining. She was exactly where she needed to be. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more true tales that move, inspire, and heal. And if you want to hear another unbelievable celebrity twist of fate, click the video now appearing on your screen. You won't want to miss what happens next.